The candle on the writing desk had guttered to almost nothing, its flame shivering against the cold breath sliding beneath the library door. The Duke of Ashworth hadn't stirred. His fingers lay on the same ledger page he'd turned to an hour ago, though his eyes had long since abandoned the numbers. He wasn't studying columns of figures. He was watching the hands of the woman who had just placed his tea at the desk's corner, hands that moved with an exactness he couldn't account for. The saucer met the wood without the smallest tremor of porcelain touching porcelain. Those hands withdrew as soundlessly as they'd appeared. Agnes Thornbury did not lift her gaze as she stepped away. She never did. Yet in that sliver of a moment before she turned for the door, something in the tilt of her wrist, in the quiet rigidity of her retreating shoulders, stirred a memory so far buried it surfaced not as thought, but as raw sensation. Smoke, the copper tang of blood, the pressure of fingers forcing linen against torn flesh in darkness. He opened his mouth. She pulled the door shut behind her, and the library, enormous, walled with 10,000 volumes, had never felt so profoundly hollow. 7 years had passed since the Crimea. Percival Pemberton, 5th Duke of Ashworth, had spent nearly every one of them searching. The war had stripped from him what wars always strip away: certainty, peace, the comfortable delusion that the world follows rules a man can discern. But it had also pressed upon him something unasked for and impossible to surrender: a debt. He recalled little of the night itself. The siege of Sevastopol had dissolved into fire and shrapnel and the shrieking of horses. He'd been struck not by a bullet but by a beam. A burning timber crashed across his shoulder as the field hospital tent burst into flame. He remembered the heat. He remembered canvas ripping apart. And he remembered hands, small hands, startlingly powerful, seizing his coat and hauling him through frozen mud while the world blazed orange at his back. A voice. Low, steady English, not the polished tones of an officer's wife, but something rougher, more northern, telling him to be still, to breathe, to let her work. She had cauterized the wound herself. He knew this because the army surgeon who inspected him the following morning said as much with open astonishment, noting that whoever had done it possessed either formal training or an instinct that bordered on genius. By dawn, she had vanished. No name in any register, no face he could reconstruct with certainty. Only the memory of those hands and that voice, and the scar across his left shoulder that throbbed each winter like a second heartbeat. He had hired investigators. He had written to every military hospital between Scutari and Balaclava. He had sent discreet inquiries through the network of officers' wives who had nursed alongside Miss Nightingale's detachment. Nothing. The woman who had saved the Duke of Ashworth's life had disappeared as completely as if she'd never drawn breath. And Percival, raised since boyhood to believe that every problem yields to sufficient money and persistence, found himself facing something unfamiliar: the possibility that some debts simply cannot be repaid. Not because the creditor refuses payment, but because the creditor cannot be found. It was his mother, the Dowager Duchess, who first suggested the search had ceased to be about gratitude. You do not spend 4 years hunting for someone merely to say thank you, Percival. Her voice carried that particular dryness she saved for truths her son wasn't prepared to hear. __, quote _1__. He had offered no reply. The Dowager returned to her soup. The subject was not raised again. Meanwhile, Agnes Thornbury delivered his tea each morning at 8:30, opened the curtains in the east-facing rooms at precisely 7, and moved through Ashworth Park with the practiced invisibility that separated an excellent servant from a merely competent one. She had arrived 2 years prior, carrying a letter of character from a Mrs. Eldon of Harrogate, a letter that was, in every material respect, genuine. Mrs. Eldon had indeed employed a quiet young woman of that name for a period of 14 months. What the letter failed to disclose, because Mrs. Eldon herself did not possess this knowledge, was that Agnes Thornbury had not always carried that name. She had entered the world as Agnes Martell, the youngest daughter of a country surgeon in Northumberland, a man who had poured into her, before death claimed him, every scrap of wisdom he possessed. The treatment of wounds, the setting of bones, the careful application of common herbs against fever and infection. When war arrived, she volunteered under a fabricated surname, Ashby, because unmarried women of no particular standing found few doors open to the nursing detachments. And because her father's debts, accumulated through the long decline of his final illness, had transformed the Martel name into a mark of shame across the county where she'd been raised. 11 months she served. By her own quiet estimation, she had preserved perhaps a dozen lives. Among them, the life of a duke she had not recognized as anything more than a man, because he had been drenched in blood and caked in mud, and the insignia on his coat had been scorched past all identification. Afterward, she returned home, changed her name once more, buried Agnes Ashby beside Agnes Martel in the unmarked grave of reinvention, and became Agnes Thornberry, a woman without a past worth speaking of and without a future worth dreaming toward. She had not planned to arrive at Ashworth Park. The position came through a registry in York, and she accepted it because the wages were honest, and the estate lay far enough from Northumberland to make discovery improbable. Only on her third day, when she overheard the housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, mention the Duke's war injury in passing conversation, did comprehension settle upon her. Cold, absolute, like frost crystallizing across glass. That evening she sat in her narrow room beneath the eaves, perched on the edge of her bed, hands pressed flat against her knees, breathing with deliberate slowness, deciding. She could leave, find another position, another house, another county entirely. Or she could remain, trust in the immense, uncrossable distance between a duke and a housemaid to keep her secret where it belonged, in darkness, beneath the surface, where it could wound neither of them. She chose to stay. And for 2 years, that choice held firm. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in late November. One of the footmen, a young man called Daniels, sliced his palm open on a shattered carriage lamp. The wound ran deep, bleeding freely. Chaos seized the servants' hall, the cook pressing a dishcloth against it, the scullery maid weeping, Mrs. Calloway dispatching someone to fetch the village physician. And Agnes acted without thought. She took Daniels's hand, examined the cut with a stillness that silenced the room, cleaned it with boiled water, bound it in strips of fresh linen, folded in a pattern so exact, so unmistakably professional, that Mrs. Calloway stared at her for a full 10 seconds before words returned. "Where on earth did you learn to do that, girl?" Agnes offered a small, controlled smile that surrendered nothing, said only that her father had been fond of practical knowledge. The matter was allowed to rest. But that evening, over port in the dining room, Mrs. Calloway mentioned the incident to the Duke. Percival said nothing at the time. Yet the following morning, when Agnes brought his tea, his gaze tracked her hands with unusual attention. He noticed how she folded the napkin, not with the careless efficiency of a servant repeating a familiar task, but with deliberate, measured folds, the folds of someone trained to prepare bandages. He noticed faint stains on her fingertips, not from polish, not from blacking, from something vegetal, something herbal, something that struck him with a jolt that nearly sent his cup clattering, as identical to the field hospitals where women had crushed yarrow and comfrey between their fingers before pressing poultices against wounds that refused to cease bleeding. He told himself he was being absurd. He told himself that a housemaid capable of dressing a cut proved nothing beyond a practical upbringing. He repeated these assurances with the same conviction he had employed for 7 years, insisting that the search for his rescuer was merely a matter of honor, and he believed them about as thoroughly. The second crack arrived 3 weeks later, on a night when a storm descended upon Ashworth Park with such ferocity that window panes shuddered in their frames and the dogs crawled whimpering beneath the furniture. Percival had not slept through thunder in years. The sound dragged him back every time, to the bombardment, to shells splitting frozen ground. So he was standing at his study window, wide awake, when a light moved through the herb garden below, past midnight, rain falling in curtains, and there, coatless in the downpour, was Agnes Thornberry. She was cutting rosemary by the glow of a lantern she'd hung from the gate. He watched her for several minutes. She moved with intention, not haste, selecting stems, cutting them clean, gathering them into a folded cloth. Something in her bearing, the way her shoulders set against the rain, did not belong to a servant running an errand. This was the posture of someone who could not sleep, someone who had gone to the one place that still made sense to her, performing an act so deeply worn into habit it required no thought, and therefore granted a kind of stillness. He knew that posture. He had stood at this exact window the same way across 100 sleepless nights, staring into darkness, waiting for the noise inside his skull to quiet. The next morning he asked Mrs. Calloway whether Miss Thornberry regularly tended the herb garden. Mrs. Calloway, caught off guard, said she had noticed the garden looking unusually well kept of late. She had assumed the groundsman's boy deserved the credit. Percival offered nothing more. But from that day, something shifted in how his attention moved. He began to see Agnes not as a presence in the room, which she had always been, but as a person within that presence. He noticed she flinched, barely perceptibly, at sudden, loud sounds. He noticed a stillness in the way she carried herself that was not shyness, but practiced erasure. The careful economy of someone trained to take up as little space as possible. He noticed that when she believed herself unwatched, her face changed. The mask of pleasant emptiness gave way to something far more layered, something that looked very much like grief kept at careful distance. And he found himself wanting, with an urgency that disturbed him, to understand its source. He began inventing reasons to occupy the room she was cleaning. He began taking his tea later, so their encounter in the library stretched from the usual 30 seconds to a minute, then 2. He asked her questions, small, deliberate questions about the household, about the garden, about the book he'd found her reading when he came upon her unexpectedly in the servants' sitting room. She answered with the same quiet composure she carried into everything, giving just enough to satisfy courtesy, not one syllable beyond it. But once, when he mentioned the Crimea in passing, a reference to a letter from a former officer, he saw her hands tighten on the tray she held, saw the blood drain from her knuckles. He saw the fraction of a second when her composure fractured like ice over moving water, before she gathered herself and excused herself from the room. It lasted less than a heartbeat, but he saw it. "You are watching that girl," the Dowager Duchess remarked one afternoon, her gaze never lifting from her embroidery. They sat in the morning room. Agnes had just departed after bringing fresh flowers, lavender and chamomile, arranged with an instinct for harmony that bore no resemblance to the usual careless efforts of the staff. "Do not insult us both by denying it." "I am not watching her," Percival replied in a tone that would have persuaded anyone who did not know him. "You have reorganized your entire morning so that you happen to be in the library when she brings your tea. You asked Mrs. Calloway 4 separate questions about her history within a single week, and yesterday you stood at the window 20 minutes watching her cross the courtyard." The Dowager set her needle down. "Percival, I have known you for 32 years. You do nothing without reason. What is your reason?" He did not respond at once. When he spoke, his voice held an uncertainty she had seldom heard there. "There is something about her I cannot account for. Something familiar, something I feel I should recognize, yet cannot place." "Perhaps," the Dowager said softly, "you recognize loneliness. It does tend to know its own kind. The crisis, when it arrived, came not through revelation, but through emergency. It was a merciless February evening when Polly, the youngest kitchen maid, barely 19, crumpled onto the scullery floor. Her skin scorched beneath every hand that touched her, each breath scraped out of her chest, shallow and torn. The village physician sat 3 miles away, and the roads were sheathed in ice. Mrs. Calloway sent a boy on horseback anyway, her face drained of all color. But everyone gathered in the servants' hall understood the same grim arithmetic. The girl needed help now, not in an hour. Agnes did not pause for permission. She did not seek guidance. She walked into the kitchen, swept the long table clear, called for boiling water and clean cloths, and began. Her composure was so total, so commanding, that not a single person in that room thought to challenge her. She examined the girl, pressed an ear to her chest. Then she prepared a tincture from herbs she had been cultivating in the garden. Herbs that, everyone now realized, had never been intended for seasoning. They were medicine. She spoke to Polly in a low, unwavering tone, the same voice she had used 7 years prior in the choking dark of a field hospital engulfed by fire, murmuring to a stranger that he must lie still, breathe, let her work. Percival appeared in the kitchen doorway 12 minutes later, dragged there by a breathless footman. He stopped. The scene unfolding before him shattered every assumption he had built about this woman over weeks of quiet observation. For a moment, words abandoned him entirely. Agnes was bent over the kitchen maid, sleeves shoved to her elbows, hands moving with the swift and certain grace of someone who had done this 100 times. Nothing in her bearing belonged to a housemaid, nothing in her voice, nothing in the set of her spine. She raised her head and saw him. Their eyes locked through the veil of steam and lamplight, and in that single breath, 2 years of painstaking concealment fell apart, silently, completely, like a house of cards caught in a draft. She understood that he knew, not the specifics, not the name she had used, not the night itself, but the essential truth, the thing she had buried beneath a servant's uniform and a borrowed name. She was not who she had claimed to be. His expression, as he stood braced against the doorframe, told her something she had not prepared for. He was not furious. He was devastated. Polly's fever broke before dawn. The physician, arriving at last, examined the girl and declared without hesitation that whoever had treated her had almost certainly preserved her life. He asked to meet the person responsible. Mrs. Calloway directed him to Agnes, who answered each question with her usual careful restraint, offering precisely enough medical knowledge to justify the treatment, and not one detail more. The physician saw through it immediately, quote 11, he said. It was not a question. Agnes held his gaze with the steady composure of a woman who had long accepted this reckoning was inevitable. Quote, _12, she replied. It was the first honest thing she had spoken within these walls. She found Percival waiting in the library at 6:30 that morning. The fire had guttered low. The room carried the scent of ash and aged leather and the faintest thread of rosemary, crushed between her own fingers during the long night. He stood at the window. He did not turn when she entered, but she read it in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the way his fingers tightened against the curtain. He had heard the door. Quote 13, she said, because formality was the only shield still left to her. Quote 14. His voice came quiet, not cold, quiet. Quote, _15, She sat. He stayed at the window, motionless, for what felt like an age. When he finally turned, his face wore an expression she had witnessed only once before, on the night she had knelt beside him in the mud outside a burning tent and watched him fight to stay conscious. It was the face of a man confronting something he had searched for across years, arriving in a shape he could never have foreseen. Quote 16, he said slowly. Quote 17, a pause. His voice fell lower still. Quote 18, Agnes said nothing. Her hands rested in her lap, utterly still, because she had taught herself years ago that the body could be governed even when the heart could not. Quote 19, he said, not a question. The silence that followed stretched longer than any she had ever known. Then, very quietly, quote 20, he crossed the room. Not quickly. There was nothing impulsive in his movement. He walked with the deliberate, measured stride of a man who understood that whatever he said next would determine everything. He lowered himself into the chair opposite hers, close enough that she could see the faint tremor along his jaw, the dampness gathering at the corners of his eyes. He made no effort to hide it, Agnes said, and for the first time her composure faltered, not in her hands, not in her posture, in her voice, which cracked on the final word like a branch bending under too much snow. He said, leaning forward, his voice rough with something that was not anger, not gratitude, but something far more dangerous than either. She looked at him. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the first gray light of a February dawn